Good morning, everybody. I am Terry Benez, and I lead the Williamsburg Business Council. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 Legislative Forum. Thanks, everybody, for getting up early and being here with us today. I'd like to recognize a few of our guests and thank them for joining. Senator Tommy Norment, Senator Monty Mason, Representative Amanda Batten, Representative Mike Mullen, Chair of the Alliance, Sherry Green, Chair of the Business Council, Julie Sums, Chair of the Tourism Council, Ruth Larson, Kira Cook, Chair of the Legislative Affairs Committee, who will be their moderator today, and members of the Legislative Affairs Committee, and City Manager Andrew Trevette, Mayor Doug Pons, Honorable Laura Overy, EDA Chair Rick Overy, City Councilwoman Barb Ramsey, and for everybody else, thank you for joining us today. It's my pleasure of introducing Angie Bezick. She's the Vice Chair of our Legislative Affairs Committee. She's also the owner of Principal Advantage Government Relations Group. Angie's company is a presenting sponsor for this morning. Thank you, Angie, and Principal Advantage Government Relations Group. Angie, I'd now like to turn it over to you to get started.
Thank you, Terry. I am so pleased to be able to support the Greater Williamsburg Chamber Business Council's 2021 Legislative Forum. Although our format has shifted a bit from past years due to this very unwelcomed COVID health crisis, that does not stop your business council from making sure that our members are able to communicate with our General Assembly delegation as they prepare to return to Richmond for the legislative session. Our moderator for this morning's forum should be well known to most of you. Kira Cook is the Director of Strategy for the Williamsburg Health Foundation and also serves on the Williamsburg James City County School Board. Not sure who that is. Sorry. Kira has served in our community for many years and in many capacities. From the arts to education and beyond, Kira has given her time and talent. So now, as an Alliance board member and the chair of the Legislative Affairs Committee, she will guide our forum this morning. Thank you, Kira, for all you have done for our fellow citizens and the Business Council members.
Thank you, Angie. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to speak a little bit about Angie. Angie is somewhat of a newcomer to our community, and she has jumped in with both feet here at the Business Council. As owner of Principal Advantage Government Relations Group, our sponsor this morning, her experience in Richmond has been very welcomed as a member of the Legislative Affairs Committee and to our greater community as a whole. Angie created a guide to legislative advocacy for use by the members of the Business Council. It's essentially an advocacy 101 guide for our members. And I encourage you all to read the guide when it is sent out to membership as part of our regular General Assembly updates. We appreciate her and her company serving as a presenting sponsor for this morning's forum. Thank you, Angie and Principal Advantage. Before we begin, I'd also like to recognize Terry Benez, who serves as the CEO of the Greater Williamsburg Chamber and Tourism Alliance and Business Council. She and her team worked tirelessly to put this event together today, so thank you for that. And now a word about today's format and a bit of background about why and how we put this annual event together. Our mission is to advocate, collaborate, and create an environment in which business can grow and succeed. We host this event as part of our advocacy work. And to determine our advocacy topics, we surveyed membership, and nearly 100 members responded. And what they told us was that we support the work of the Virginia Chamber of Commerce and their Blueprint Virginia 2025. And we also support the work of the Hampton Roads Regional Chamber Alliance, which includes chambers of commerce from here to Virginia Beach. And positions that they support include financial support for economic development, education, workforce development, the Port of Virginia, passenger rail, and military. Our members also highlighted 6 additional priorities of significant import to them. Our morning will focus on those topics which have been shared with all of you. Business Council members had the opportunity to submit questions prior to this event, and we have woven some of those questions into today's topics. Members may also submit questions this morning via the chat function. If we are unable to get to a question, we will follow up with you individually after the event. Please ask questions that are directly related to the work of the Greater Williamsburg Chamber and Tourism Alliance. While issues that have larger societal impact are of no doubt important to us all, We would like to remain hyper-focused on business-related topics this morning. Thank you for your understanding. So this morning I will ask questions round robin style and ask each of our General Assembly delegation members to comment for up to 2 minutes. After that, I will ask if anyone else would like to chime in. So we plan to wrap up within an hour or so. So before we jump into the questions, I'd like to thank you all for being on this morning's call and introduce our General Assembly delegation. First up is Senator Tommy Norment. He has served in the General Assembly since 1992, and he currently serves as the minority leader of the Senate of Virginia. A Republican, he represents the 3rd Senatorial District. Senator Norment graduated from the Virginia Military Institute and received his law degree from the William and Mary School of Law. Welcome, Senator Norment.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Senator Monty Mason, a Democrat, represents the 1st District in the Virginia Senate. He has served in the Virginia General Assembly since 2014. Senator Mason was born in Farmville, Virginia, and he attended the College of William and Mary, graduating in 1989 with a degree in government. Welcome, Senator Mason.
Thank you, ma'am. Good morning.
And then Delegate Mike Mullen, a Democrat, has been a member of the Virginia House of Delegates representing the 93rd District since 2016. Delegate Mullen graduated from Christopher Newport University in 2004 and was awarded his JD from Catholic University in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Delegate Mullen.
Pleasure to be with you.
And last but not least, Delegate Amanda Batten, a Republican, has served in the Virginia House of Delegates since 2020 and represents the 96th District. She's a graduate of both Ashford University and the University of Virginia's Sorensen Political Leaders Program. Welcome, Delegate Batten.
Morning, happy to be here.
Thank you. So first, we'd like to start with opening statements by each panelist in turn. And again, I will call on you. But if for the benefit of our membership, if you could at a big picture level, tell us what you aim to accomplish this session of the General Assembly. And also I'd like to throw in a question from member Rick Overy. He wants to know if we can also expect bipartisan cooperation. So first I'll call on you, Senator Norment.
Thank you very much, Kara. I appreciate it. I'm so old, I can almost remember when we used to hold these meetings and we would get coffee and juice and pastries. So this is it's quite a throwback, and thank everybody for joining in. Picking up on the last comment that was made and I raised by Rick Overy, I think it's very important for everyone on this call to understand that while our local delegation is composed of both Republicans and Democrats, that we do have a common interest that we focus on and we focus on very strongly. And that is advocating and advancing the communities that we represent. A very small percentage of legislation that comes before the General Assembly is really partisan charged. 2020 may have been an unusual situation, but generally I would say 90+% of the legislation that comes through does not have a partisan overtone on it. So Monty, Mike, and Amanda and I try to work together collaboratively on those issues that are going to advance the historic triangle, whether it's, economic development, focusing on education, focusing on law and order. And we will continue to do that. Looking forward to 2020, obviously some very significant issues are continuing to deal with this pandemic situation and how that's going to disrupt the orderly flow of government. We've got to revisit the budget and make a realignment based upon the revenues that are coming on that. So I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues and certainly look forward to hearing from members of our community with ideas that they'd like to share.
Thank you, sir. Senator Mason, would you like to respond?
Good morning. Sure. Thank you all for joining. It's good. I always enjoy this event. I would say you'd be hard pressed to find more than just a handful of things that this delegation hasn't come together and agreed on. And even when we disagreed on on a couple of the matters, we all still come together from regional perspective. So I have, in my entire tenure, which is not that long, we've been 2 and 2, and I have been extraordinarily pleased with the friendship, the work, the cooperation, the collaboration we've had as a team. So I think I hope that you see it the same way, and I think the region is a beneficiary to that. Tommy's exactly right. The bulk of what we do is not necessarily R&D. It's urban versus rural. It's regional. It's the special session might have been the glaring example. So, because I always say that 10 or 15% of what we do is R&D, and Tommy says, it's not that much. Good grief, you're exaggerating. And yet, what the key here is you read about every one of them. So a lot of the special session was very contentious, and so you read about a lot of that. I expect that to return to normal, other than the fact that our session will be anything but. The House of Delegates will meet across the state. The Senate will meet in the Science Museum again, but we're still trying to figure out timelines. We're trying to figure out how that's going to work. And to the bulk of the professional world, it will be like this, because a lot of what we do is interaction in the hallways, on the way to committees, on the way to the floor with people, and that will cease to exist. So I think it's going to be really difficult. And so we probably need to be mindful of taking major policy initiatives and moving forward in what will be a format we've never dealt with. We dealt with it in a special session, but we've never dealt with it in general. And Senator Norman nailed it. He always says that the most important thing we do in Richmond is the budget. And we still have about $1.8 billion of monies that we passed in budget last March that is unallotted. And the last check was like $1.4 billion worth of revenue. I think that picture continues to look better. So figuring out where we reallot, where we reapply monies that we determined were important to us initially in the first part of the budget, I think will be the key to this next session. It's going to be challenging, but at the same time, you'll be able to reach out to us electronically and make sure that the things that are important to you in the region and the business community we know about and we act on.
Thank you, sir. Delegate Mullen, would you like to comment?
Well, first, Kira, thank you very much for putting this together, and I appreciate the Business Council being able to take a moment of their morning to be able to chat with us a little bit. I guess I would mostly say I would agree with everything that Monty and Tommy said, that during this last few years that I've had the honor and privilege of representing Williamsburg, our business is tourism, and the advocacy that we need to be able to do to be able to bring people back here to the historic triangle is of the utmost importance. I think that during this upcoming General Assembly session, you're going to see a lot of discussion about the budget. Senator Mason mentioned unallotted funds. I would add to that we have a significant disparate number when it comes to funding for our local schools. Local schools have historically been funded based on active school population, but because fully a quarter of all students have taken themselves out of the public school system as a result of COVID, there's a lot of money that may not be going to our schools very soon. And so the General Assembly in the past session extended a moratorium on those changes. And I expect that that's going to be one of the primary things that we talk about in this upcoming session. I will say that second to the budget, I think the other important thing that we do is select judges, and that during the course of this upcoming session, Williamsburg and James City County have the possibility of seeing up to 3 new judges that we will be spending a great deal of time thinking about, because that affects everyone in our community, whether from a criminal justice perspective or from a civil perspective, which affects our business community. Who is on the bench is of utmost importance. And so you're going to see a sea change here in Williamsburg, James City County.
Thank you very much. Delegate Batten?
Good morning. First of all, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to join this morning. Thank you, Angie, for sponsoring and coordinating this, and Kira for facilitating it. If you've attended these in the past, typically today is like the coldest day of the year, and we all struggle to get ourselves out of our warm houses. So I guess it's a little bit nice that this year, if we chose to do so, we could actually not leave our houses. So I guess that's a plus of this whole virtual world in which we find ourselves. I'll certainly echo, what Monty and Tommy and Mike said. I think that our delegation does work well together. We recognize that we have unique needs in the historic triangle. I think we tend to think of partisan differences, but in reality, a lot of what we see in Richmond are regional differences, kind of the Nova arrayed against the rest of the state, if you will. The sheer number of legislators that they have, the fact that they control a lot of the committees, and the fact that their priorities and their economy are very different than ours here in this area. I think one of the challenges we're going to have this year is we're not going to be meeting together in person. The Senate will be over in the Science Museum, the House will be strewn across the state. And, for those of us who are attempting to collaborate as a delegation, we are not going to have those opportunities to run into each other in the hallway, to meet in the back of the chamber, or to just have those conversations that sort of facilitate the legislative process. And so, I think we're just going to have to be very conscious that we're going to need to intentionally reach out to each other and collaborate. Mike brought up judges. That's a great example. Certainly the delegation has conversations there. And we won't have that chance this year to kind of, have those conversations offline during the legislative session. As far as what we accomplished during this legislative session, I think one of the things I'm hearing from a lot of people is just, please do no harm. It's been a really tough year for folks throughout Virginia. There are certainly winners and losers. If you look at our state revenue, it's much better than what we thought it would be. But if you look at, if you sort of break that down a little bit, you can see that it's driven more by larger businesses doing well. And then we see a lot of small businesses that are really, really struggling to stay afloat. So I think that that's going to be a balancing act that we're going to try to strike this year, is to figure out how we, work with these small businesses. How do we support that really important economic sector of Virginia's economy? And again, Mike mentioned schools. That's a huge issue. I think, we're starting to see more and more families who are almost at the point of desperation, I would say, and trying to figure out how this distance learning will work, if it works. And, we're going to need to certainly address that, because not doing so as a legislature, I think is a little bit of a slap in the face to all the parents out there who are struggling day to day to try to get by in this strange educational environment. So trying to keep it short here, and I will turn it back over to Kira. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Patton. I appreciate that. So now we're going to move on to transportation. And I just wanted to make a comment that it's a priority of the Alliance's membership to widen I-64 all the way to Richmond. And we know that everyone in our delegation supports the I-64 widening. As you all mentioned before, there's very little about which you disagree. But I'd like to know specifically what you intend to do this year to hasten 3 lanes both ways from Jameson County westward to Bottoms Bridge. Just also like to note that I'm going to ask Senator Mason to answer this question, because he, along with Delegate Mullins, serve on the Hampton Roads Transportation Sustainability Commission and are actively involved. And so perhaps, Senator Mason, you can answer that question and maybe explain some of the complexities around the topic, essentially because part of this section of 64 is sort of orphaned in terms of responsibility.
Sure, and Kira, that's really well framed, because everyone agrees with that. We need to get that done, but the mechanics of how that works, and you mentioned Mike and I do serve on HR TAC, and I'm on the finance committee there, trying to figure. We have, I think it's still 27 miles left, even with the work done down through Bottoms Bridge, but only 7 miles of that is in our Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission area. So that leaves, about 20 miles in no man's land. Now, Richmond we put together in the last session a kind of an HR TAC for Richmond. I don't know that it will include New Kent County. I don't think it does. And so then the next step, the way to fund these things, is smart scale. And smart scale is a brilliant idea that we look at moving more people, moving more traffic, and applying the money in places that we can get the most bang for our buck. Unfortunately, when you go past upper 199, the traffic counts fall off precipitously. So it is going to be very difficult for that last 20 miles to smart scale. We have been pressing in HR TAC to finish the job that in our area and try to spur some development, some movement that way. But trying to determine how we apply those funds, because it's very specific. Smart scale is to be applied in this way. And when we set it up, Vivian Watts called out very clearly, when you set it up, there are going to be segments of road that need significant work that never smart scale. And particularly, you mentioned Northern Virginia, they have projects constantly coming on smart scale to kick things off. The example I always use is Grove, going through 60 past Busch Gardens through Grove. A couple of years ago, we had a tragic head-on-head accident. The fire trucks and ambulance couldn't even get to it because it's 2 lanes with deep ditches and no shoulders. So widening of 60 through Grove and down to the Newport News Reservoir would be a really important step, especially with the number of trucks. We're trying to get that flyover done there as well. But that project will never smart scale. So you're not going to be able to use bigger monies, and you're going to have to, and when that falls to localities, it becomes a very large number. So you're right. We all agree 3 lanes all the way to Richmond is critical. Figuring how we get it slotted on the 6-year plan is the challenge.
Thank you, Senator. Would anyone else like to weigh in on that?
If I might for a moment, as part of the sort of patchwork that we've created of regional authorities, one that came up last year was the expansion of I-81 through the Shenandoah Valley, which has been an incredibly dangerous road, in part because it is so heavily commercially trafficked. As part of the larger legislative package that allowed for some additional revenues to go towards the eventual expansion of I-81, there was a small amount of money that was attributed specifically to I-64. It is not a ton, but it is some, and it's roughly about $10 million or so. At the end, I think it will be close to 30. That's not enough to be able to finish the last 27 miles, but it is enough to start bonding on. And so we get a lot closer because of those additional monies. The only problem is that we're continuing to compete with all other localities on the I-64 corridor. So Charlottesville and Richmond, who both have a lot of traffic on 64 as well, are grabbing for those monies as well. So we at least now have a small but consistent revenue stream that is bondable that I think will get us closer to where we need to be. The last time that there was an environmental analysis, and someone please correct me, I thought it was close to about $400 million to be able to complete the last 27 miles, which is a significant amount of money, in part because of the environmental impact studies and such that need to be done a little further north of 199. And so I'm hopeful that those monies are now there, that we'll be able to continue this process and start actually doing some studying and doing some additional work, but we're still a long way to go.
Thank you, Delegate. Would anyone else like to add anything before we move on?
Kara, Tommy, just to put a little bit of a point on it, the Historic Triangle is very fortunate in that we've got both Monty and Mike out on the point on this advocating on our behalf. So we've got a very strong presence from an advocacy standpoint with these 2 individuals, and we should be very indebted to their advocacy.
Thank you. Appreciate your taking the time to help us understand the complexities around widening I-64, but we're hopeful that we'll be able to make some progress in the not too distant future. Now I'd like to move on to taxes. As Delegate Batten mentioned earlier in her remarks, there are a lot of small businesses that are struggling to stay afloat. It is a priority of the Alliance's membership to protect businesses from being taxed on forgiven payroll protection or PPP loans at the state level. Terry Benez asks if you can talk about what, if any, action you anticipate the General Assembly will take regarding including forgiven PPP loans as taxable income for state income tax purposes. Delegate Mullen, do you mind taking this one first?
Happy to. So what you're talking about right now is one of the most significant tax decisions that we're going to have to make. As our joint finance and appropriations committees laid out about 4 weeks ago or so. And we're talking about a significant amount of money, about $600 million or so, that if we were to make those forgivenesses, would have to be replaced in the state budget. And here in Virginia, we live within our means. We have a balanced budget. We can't just print money like the federal government. And I think that's probably a good thing. And so if we were to make those decisions about PPP forgiveness, those $600 million will come from someplace else. I am not on appropriations or finance, and so I can't speak to some of the negotiations and some of the back and forth. I know some of our delegation we've been lucky enough to have on those committees for quite some time. And so I would defer to them in terms of how they see negotiation over the course of the next 37 days or so. Senator Norman?
Well, I thank you, Mike. That was a nice lateral you did there.
Gotta,
I just hope I don't fumble the ball here. A little bit of humor is a good thing, either in a new year. I think Mike set it up pretty well. When we look at the budget, we have to look at it in a holistic sense. And if you start extracting various parts out of it and focus on those without keeping an eye on the overall impact of the budget, you're going to have some problems. I realize that there's a lot of largesse in government, at least in the minds of our citizens. $600 million is not an inconsequential amount of money, especially in these uncertain economic times. I think from a philosophical approach that probably everyone in the delegation would like to provide forgiveness and tax relief on these PPP loans. But we have to look at it in the sense of what is the fiscal impact going to be on the entire budget? If it's 600 million that we provide for forgiveness there, then where are we going to recover that 600 million? Is it going to come in additional revenues? At this point, we don't know. If it doesn't come in additional revenues, then it becomes a discussion of prioritization. And prioritization focuses on the core delivery of services that our citizens expect. But there's also some parochial concerns when we get into the prioritization of our budget. So I think it's a little premature for us to put a stake in the ground and say unequivocally, there is going to be tax relief and forgiveness on these PPP loans. We've really got to get some additional information and we will get it very shortly. We'll have some numbers that will come in for December, maybe around the 15th or 16th. We'll see what the holiday season yielded in the terms of sales tax. And that will be the beginning of the budgetary discussion. So everyone agrees we'd like to give forgiveness, but we have to make those hard decisions on what our prioritization is going to be.
Thank you, Senator. Would anyone else like to weigh in? Well, we appreciate anything you can do to help our local businesses out in that capacity. So now moving on to education, specifically vocational training. Delegate Mullen mentioned school funding earlier, and Delegate Batten talked about really this needs of families who are struggling in a virtual environment. So maybe we'll get back to those topics later towards the end if we have time, but specifically, we wanted to talk about vocational training at the high school level, including apprenticeships. And recognizing that each community is different and schools need regional support for identifying workforce needs, developing appropriate training, opportunities, connecting students with business partners, and providing on-the-job experiencing. Would you support increased funding for infrastructure needed to provide those apprentice internship opportunities for high school students? And Delegate Batten, I'm gonna toss this to you first because of your deep knowledge about the K-12 education in our state.
I don't know that I have deep knowledge about the K-12 educational system, but I'll give it a shot. This is something that I heard a lot about when I was campaigning last year. And, I think folks really expressed interest, both, parents, students, and employers alike. This year, obviously, everything was thrown for a loop. We didn't really have these conversations because schools literally shut down as soon as we came out of our General Assembly session. A lot of our local businesses did likewise, and many of the the conversations that I think we would normally had just didn't occur this year, and they're not on the horizon right now yet either because of the ongoing challenges with the coronavirus. It is something that I support, but to the point that Monty and Mike and Tommy all made, a dollar only spends one way. So if this is something that we choose, to invest in as a Commonwealth, then we need to recognize that that's funding that's not going to go somewhere else. So again, it just goes back to the priorities that we have. I personally tend to think that this is something that pays dividends down the road. I think especially now, with everything that's transpired in the past year, I'm hearing even more interest in this particular subject, where students in high school are looking toward their future and saying, you know, I don't know that I want to do this virtual thing. I'm rethinking some of my college plans. You know, my son is in college right now, and I know a lot of his peers and friends who are a little bit younger than him are already looking and going in a different direction. So I think that there's certainly a high level of interest in it. As far as, you know, what exactly that plan looks like, I think there's still work to be done, but absolutely it should be continue to be, you know, a priority, regardless of the challenges that we're facing. But hopefully here within the next 6 months, as folks start to get vaccinated and things start to get back to normal, we can refocus on some of these long-term investments in the educational system here.
Thank you. I'd like to also add to your observation that there really has been a sort of seismic shift in perception. I think it's important, though, to educate parents about the value of vocational training as a viable option for their children. That sometimes is a barrier as well. Would anyone like to weigh in with an add to what Delegate Batten has talked about?
Let me add something to that. Start with the premises. I think as we look at post-secondary education, we've got to continue to educate the parents, as you mentioned. Not every young person needs to go to a 2 or 4 year college. There was a very enlightening argument in the Virginia Business newspaper maybe a week ago about vocational training and the pent-up demand for technical jobs. I've been in a lot of different businesses in my career and have failed in most of them, but I've learned a couple of things from them. And when I was in the car business, it was a rude awakening to me when I found out that we were paying car techs $75,000 and $80,000 to tune up our cars and do inspections and things. There is a very comfortable living that can be made out there in some of these vocational and technical industries. Virginia in the past has recognized the importance of it. We extended a grant to the shipyard for their apprentice school to have them bring more young people in there to train them in pent-up demands that they had at the shipyard, not the least of which was welders, and they were very well compensated. I think we need to continue to emphasize the importance of internships and get more and more businesses to reach out to young people to provide them with that ongoing experience. I know out in sort of Southwest Virginia, a good friend of mine was head of a manufacturing educational facility out there. And one of the first things that he did when he took over that organization was he started going into the middle school and speaking to these classes about the importance of vocational training and the opportunities that were there. He made the policy decision that high school was too late. And he spent an awful lot of time in these middle schools trying to introduce these young people to the concept of vocational training. So I think there's a lot of pent-up demand, and they're very comfortable livings that could be made that would make Attorney Mullen and I embarrassed with what they can earn.
Well, and this is a place the business community needs to help us, because Tommy just mentioned the word internship, which means generally you're not getting paid. We offer, but you say very specifically here, apprenticeships, which is different. Apprenticeships is an educational component along with a compensation component. But very often when we bring bills forward that require and ask for apprenticeships, the business community comes to us and says, whoa, 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 whoa. Now, and Kira, in fairness, you did also mention paying for an internship, apprenticeships. So that is fair. But the business community said, wait. We do this on our own. A car dealer locally said, we do apprenticeships. Don't mandate, don't make us do it. But is it getting enough traction? Because like I say, every time we bring a bill forward to require apprenticeships, we get some pretty significant pushback from the business community, unless we are going to pay and fund them entirely. So that's a place we need to work together to try to forward the objectives, because this is a great segue to workforce, because this is getting to be the continual theme. Affordable housing in our region and more apprenticeships is something we talk about every single year. And I think we could do ourselves all some good if we started putting down some markers and understanding what progress have we made. other than just talking about it on a cold winter morning in the library? What have we done in the last year to move forward on?
And if I might, for one moment, add to what we've been discussing here, the model that we have had for four-year education in the secondary education community is probably not sustainable right now. We have a number of very fine institutions of higher learning here in Virginia, but we are looking at a seismic shift in the total population of students. And so even before COVID, starting in 2022, you're going to see double-digit decreases in the number of individuals who are going into higher education institutions, whether that is, you know, some of our fine four-year education institutions, or if it's just our local community colleges. You know, we already are seeing some local community colleges that can't even keep the lights on because there's so many fewer students who are coming in. We have to recognize that we need to provide these educational opportunities, not just through our community colleges, not just through our four-year institutions, but through outside entities as well. And so I would second what Monty and Amanda and Tommy all said in terms of being able to provide real world experience. I will say from my own personal experience, my best friend when I played football in high school got a job at the same car dealership that I was at. And he's now an auto tech in Northern Virginia making $120,000 a year. And he's doing a little bit better than I am. So
Oh, don't be so modest, Mike. Come on. You know, the only lawyer on the screen right now who does better than you and I is Brian Small, and he's just sitting there being very smug.
I did see him smile. You're right about that.
there you go.
This just a public service announcement. Some of you may want to turn your screens off now so you don't get picked on by Senator Norman.
Hey, I miss seeing these folks. Put your screen on, please.
Yeah.
I'm kidding. Yeah, please. We love seeing your smiling faces. Thank you very much. I mean, I think there's a lot of funding and infrastructure work that has to be done, excuse me, to pull that off. Senator Mason hinted at the next topic I'd like to talk about, which is housing, and the fact that it's a priority of the Alliance's membership, excuse me, to support funding for affordable housing for Virginia's workforce. And the governor's proposed revisions to the biennium budget include deposits and increased deposits in the Housing Trust Fund, much of which is directed, would be directed towards rent and mortgage relief. While critical in the short term, that does not ensure long-term affordability for lower wage workers. Member Allison Brody would like to know what you will do at the state level to help localities provide affordable housing for their workforce. And Senator Norman, it's your turn.
Oh, am I supposed to start on this or Monty?
Do you mind?
No, I don't mind at all.
I catch my breath. Thank you.
I was going to say, this really, you know, I learned many years ago in the General Assembly, you can't be a general practitioner and be effective. And I'm not allowed to run the ball yet, but Monty works in this area more than I do. The governor has indicated to put additional funding in the Housing Trust Fund. Obviously, it's inadequate. The pandemic situation has only exacerbated the situation that we have with housing and affordable housing. We know in the historic triangle that we've been talking for years that so many of our personal service workers cannot afford to live in the community. And many of them reside, you know, outside of the historic triangle and commute just because of the cost of housing. One of the things that has been interesting to me as I drive around James City County and parts of York County is the incredible proliferation of new apartments that are going up. And it's tweaked my interest and have made inquiries. And I can say that the asking rental rate of many of these new apartments is not what we would characterize in the realm of affordable housing. It's going to continue to take money in the trust fund. We need to provide some incentivization to developers, whether or not they are willing to venture more into Section 8 housing. But it is particularly an acute problem, and it's not just unique to the historic triangle. If you follow any of the housing issues in Richmond, Richmond has a lot of challenges one of the difficulties they have is accessibility to affordable housing. And as they have been, reviewing some of their lower income housing and trying to redevelop it, they've had a couple of really success stories up there, but it has required the cooperation of the developers. And of course, the developers are in the business of making money. It's just a question of how much. So now, Monty, I will lateral the ball to you, sir.
Well, thank you, sir. You've been watching a lot of option football over the holidays, I see. So there's so many different components to this conversation. Affordable housing, but it also equals the ability to be able to live where you work, but get to and from work, get to and from the store. We made enormous strides in Southeastern Virginia, adding a transit component to Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission. It is separate, but it is going, we will be the fiscal agent for it. But the first time there will be a dedicated source of revenue for transit in Southeastern Virginia that will build the backbone and the framework of our transit system. Because I always say in this, I think I said it in this forum once, and a lady did actually raise her hand. How many of us, if we weren't sitting in our homes, wouldn't have took transit to the Williamsburg Library this morning? That answer is nobody. But we have to fund that now. There's a second component. Williamsburg is not a piece of that transit funding. All right. So, oh man, we're left out in the cold. Not necessarily. If we build the backbone through HRT, WADA and HRT connect down at Lee Hall, and is a vital component getting to and from Busch Gardens, getting to and from work. And so we have to think about that level of discussion. One of the, I think, more short-term fears that I have is we've worked hard. No one wants anyone to be evicted during the middle of a global pandemic. No one. One of the questions I've gotten in the last week, homeless shelters down in Newport News, COVID cases, workers, people taking advantage of the shelters. How do we get them tested? Where do we put them in order to protect everyone? How do we manage that? Okay. Well, the reason I bring that up is that we are trying to do everything we can not to cut lights off, power off, water off, or evict people during this crisis. But I had a conversation yesterday that 60 or 90 days at the end of this emergency order, we are going to have a crisis of people who have been protected throughout the course of this, as we should do everything we can. But at that point, we are going to need to figure out how to help people that have enormous balances or who have set up a payment plan and can't make them. So I think we have long term, we've got to have affordable housing. And Tommy mentioned it. We've got some larger tax credit jobs. I think we tried to get the one out in James City County approved for a tax credit, and they fell below the approval level. So we have to expand that program to make sure that when people develop, I'm sitting here looking at Midtown's apartments right here. How many of those are going to be considered affordable housing? And the answer, not many. So we have to make it worthwhile for people building these apartments to have a component of it. We have to make sure that people that live there can get to and from their jobs. But on a more immediate short term, we have to look towards what this is going to look like when we come out of this pandemic.
And if I might very quickly just put a finer point on something that Senator Mason just said, which is I happen to represent both Williamsburg as well as Newport News. And when I participated in these forums down in Newport News, what they say is they need to be able to have higher end housing, that they need to be able to have the kinds of homes that we already have in Williamsburg because they need to build the tax base. And I think part of that is exactly what Monty was saying earlier, is that part of this housing problem is also a transportation problem. And that we have affordable housing on the peninsula, but it's in Newport News. And that's 7 miles away that might as well be 1,000,000 miles. I have people in James City County say, well, I'm not going to be able to go down to Newport News to go to the grocery store, but they're driving further north into Williamsburg to be able to do it. There's a perception that the communities are so separate that never the two shall meet. And if we are going to be able to make sure that these housing issues are dealt with, we need to start thinking about transportation as well. because if someone has reliable transportation, whether that's public or private, they can live in Newport News and work in the historic triangle. And that way, the dearth of affordable housing that we have in the historic triangle can hopefully fill some of the glut that we have here in Newport News.
And just to very briefly chime in, I mean, I think not to be overlooked is the role the localities play. You know, we've had some opportunities for development in the upper part of York County. There's a strong, you know, grassroots sort of resistance to that because of the burden on the infrastructure there. People perceive that it's not, there's no good access to transportation there, to the point that, you know, other folks were making, and that we need to be careful what we do at the state level, because the localities certainly don't like it when we tell them what to do, or we force them to do something, or you know, push development where they don't want it. And that frankly is a little bit of a, I would say a block as to what we do and what we can get done. Tommy made a really good point. There's a lot of development that you kind of see in the Williamsburg area. I can think of a particularly large housing complex that's our apartment, I don't know what it is, condo complex that's over off of Lightfoot Road. Those rents are very high there. So we are building, but we're not building affordable housing, and we need to continue the conversations with the localities to make sure that we're in a partnership and agreement there.
Thank you. That's a good point. I think while it is a statewide issue and there are regions in the state that are struggling mightily with affordable housing, I think it's of note that at least in Williamsburg, James City County, our school population has a very, very high rate of homelessness, and a large majority of those families are working. We have a high number of people who are working poor. So long term, it would be great to try to figure out how to allow our workforce to live here locally. So with nothing else about housing, I would like to move on to tourism, which is the backbone of our economy, as you all know. And it is a priority of this membership to support funding for recovery grants to communities that are particularly reliant on tourism like ours. And the pandemic has been hard on our tourism sector. And I'm curious, the membership's curious if you envision any additional financial support from the state, given that some other communities reliant on tourism fared better as a direct result of decisions made in Richmond. Senator Mason, if you don't mind, I'll toss that to you first and see if anyone else wants to weigh in. And I think specifically what we're talking about is the decision that kept Busch Gardens at incredibly reduced capacity.
Yeah, yeah, we can do a lot. There will be a lot of postmortems done on this crisis, but we tried. I mean, your delegation pushed hard. We discussed it directly with the top. The timing was terrible. The timing when we were trying to open hit the first, what we thought was a summer surge that, comparatively speaking, now was about a third. And so I think Busch Gardens was a victim of their own incredible plan. They were ready. They had the ability to do it. They had it mapped out. I say it that way because other destinations that would have fallen into the bucket weren't necessarily as prepared or as ready. I was going out to see the wind turbines with the governor, and I was having this very conversation with him. About that time, out of Rudy Inlet comes a parasailing ship, a little boat. On the bow of the boat are 12 people stuffed right next to each other. How many of those people knew each other? How many of those people came to Virginia Beach together? How many of those people had masks? None. None with masks. Maybe 2 by 2 they came together. And I said, that's pretty much exactly what we're trying to avoid, right? And he said, yeah. But the difference, he differentiated the beach as outdoor with fewer touch points versus Busch Gardens, where you had rides and you had foods and you had stations. All right, so that's kind of in the rearview mirror. But your delegation pushed hard and tried there, and Great Wolf Lodge as well. Tommy and I spoke to one of the service groups, Lions Club, Rotary Club, Kiwanis Club, and we talked about direct, specific funding and to restaurants and lodging. Because if you look at the unemployment numbers and the hits that restaurants and lodging, and we only need to look at our numbers to determine how bad we got hit. But Virginia Beach fared relatively well. On a call with bankers, they called out Virginia Beach as being like the second best for hotels, and us, it has to be near the bottom up here in the Upper Peninsula. I do not think that the funding coming out of Washington was specific to restaurants or lodging again. So, you know, are we going to be able from the state level to focus directly on heavily impacted industries? I hope so, but I don't know because the need is so great. I think Tommy is carrying a bill specific to that he can speak to try to incent development. And again, I don't care where you personally fell on the 1% tax in our region. Tommy Norman is the only person that had the standing to and the ability to pull that off. You may personally be opposed to that, but even in a horrible time, it's put about $4 million into us marketing and selling our region. He stood up and said, we have to help ourselves. We cannot continue to rely on the state to help us. He had the as I said, the standing in our body and the ability to pull that off. And we should be thankful to him for that, because that is going to, and you know, you saw, I think we made adjustments in the fourth quarter of last year that helped us. And then the first quarter of this year until COVID hit, we were doing well. And so we have the ability to come out of this thing, I think largely because we have a new mechanism to do it. And we have Tommy Norman to thank for that.
Before anyone else answers, I guess, thank you for that explanation, and Senator Mason, and explaining that the entire delegation advocated for here. But I guess before anyone else chimes in, I'm curious if you think there's anything that can be done to keep our major attractions open when they demonstrate a safe way to do so in the coming season. Delegate Mullen recently reported at a public meeting that nearly 50% of tax revenue in the region stems from Busch Garden visitation. So it's critically important. So I appreciate the postmortem, but what about moving forward? If anyone wants to talk about that.
It's fair.
Senator Norman, I think you raised your hand first.
Oh, that's all right. I was going to thank Monty for that advertisement he gave it. He read it just like my mother wrote it. So I want to thank you for that.
She's so nice to me.
Yeah, she is. I know a little bit about tourism on a lot of different levels just because of opportunities that I've had and business investments that I've made. And this whole business about bringing more visitors into the community is more global than I think many people consider at first glance. If we don't have the heads in beds, then we have fewer visitors here who are going into our restaurants, which is putting great pressure on them. We've got fewer visitors going into the retail establishments, which we hope are making a disproportionate contribution to that 1% on it. Everyone is perfectly aware that there's been a dramatic disparity in the tourism markets in Virginia. And if you look at Northern Virginia, they certainly recovered a little bit better than we did. I sit on a group called GACRE, which is the Governor's Revenue Forecast, and it's made up of CEOs and CFOs around the state. We had a meeting about a month ago, and one of the members of that group is a very significant hotel tourism operator in Northern Virginia. And while he was bemoaning the stress they had, it was nothing like what we were experiencing. Virginia Beach has recovered outstandingly. The Outer Banks of North Carolina has had a bumper year. Try to rent a home down there for this coming summer, and you will be shocked at what the occupancy rate is and the reservations are already. The bottom line is I don't see a statewide stimulus package coming in for the recovery of tourism attractions. One, I don't think it is across the state as large a priority as it should be. I actually carried the legislation that created the Virginia Tourism Corporation. It never really manifested in the financial support that I had hoped. And that was one of the impetus behind putting in the historic triangle taxes, that we just could not sit around and wait for state to give us money that was never coming. And that's not dissimilar with what we did with the creation of HR TAC. So I think we're going to be in for a very slow recovery. I wish I could say there's going to be some local stimulus money on tourism. I don't see it. And unfortunately, there are going to be additional casualties. And those casualties are not just going to be properties, they're going to be in people. because if you can't get the visitors here, then you don't need the housekeeping staff at the hotels that you once had. You don't need the service staff at the restaurants that you once had. So there's going to be a continued retraction on it. But I remain effusive in my optimism, and if Mike Mullen can just convince the people in his body to put some money into tourism, I will make you the legislator of the year with the Chamber of Commerce.
Oh, well, my goodness. I'm not even sure I'm the legislator of the year in my house. So that would be nice to have. I agree wholeheartedly with Senators Norman and Mason. Busch Gardens is 383 square acres. It is the largest amusement facility on east of the Mississippi. Might be in the country. I actually don't know that. And what they said in their plan, I got to read it. It was close to 40 pages. And what they said was their normal capacity should be about 45,000 or so, but that they can keep it open at 10,000. And even at that, largest, most successful facility for amusement anywhere in the Commonwealth, certainly, we didn't get approval. And I had the luck to get a ticket to Christmastown this time, and my fiance and I went through, and it was a shell of what it has been previously because of the restrictions, because of the limitations. And, you know, Christmastown is probably our favorite place in the greater Williamsburg area every season. And Kira mentioned this before. There was a study from last year saying that well over 40% of all incoming tourism dollars are tied in some way to Busch Gardens. And that's because people will go to Busch and then they'll go to CW. And maybe they'll travel across the water and they'll go to Virginia Beach as well. But Busch is always going to be a part of that. And until we open Busch Gardens, at least at the 10,000 person level, I don't know how we're going to be able to sort of turn this around. And so I know I'm going to be continuing to advocate for that. I know everyone else in the delegation is, because Busch Gardens can do it correctly in ways that other jurisdictions, other states, other amusement facilities just haven't been able to. And I have full faith that they can.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to chime in before we move on to the next topic? So just a point of order here, we have one more question on healthcare, and then in the interest of time, we will move on to closing statements, if that's okay with all of you. The last topic is healthcare, and it is a priority of the Alliance membership to promote solutions that decrease cost, expand access, and increase quality of healthcare for the workforce. The Virginia Department of Medical Assistance Services reported that over 500,000 Virginians have enrolled in health coverage since expanded Medicaid eligibility rules took effect in January 2019. Virginia was the only state in the nation to experience a reduction in the uninsured rates between 2018 and 2019. The uninsured rate for the workforce ages of between 18 and 64 declined from 28% to 23%. That's the good news. Yet, a recent study revealed that Virginia workers paid the highest annual premium for family plans of any state. So that's the bad news. What will you do this session to help businesses decrease their costs for health insurance for their employees? Delegate Mullen, do you mind taking that first?
Oh, that's fun. All right. Well, I will say part of the reason for the uninsured rate going down is that Virginia expanded Medicaid. And that was a long and hard fought battle that I know fell under that 9% of partisan issues that Senator Norman mentioned earlier. But in terms of the insured rate, I would say that decision was a success. We promised that we would get approximately 400,000 more people onto the Medicaid rolls. It's now over 500,000. So there are many more people who have access to health insurance than they did before. The cost of that health insurance is also very high. And in some places like Charlottesville, it's particularly prohibitive. We see people who are realtors or small business owners in the greater Charlottesville area who are facing monthly premium costs that are $2,500, which can get you a lovely house here in the historic triangle for that much. There is going to be a lot of stuff said on those issues over this course of this session. I would imagine that until there is movement on the federal level, there's only so much that the state can do. A lot of these costs are very high if borne by individual states, but if spread out over the greater collective across the country, become much more affordable. And so, you know, sometimes the localities say it's up to the states, and sometimes the states say, well, it's up to the feds. And I think this is one of those areas where we can make some progress, but to make the kinds of significant changes that Kira, you and others have suggested, I think we need to get some additional help from our federal partners.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to talk about healthcare costs?
Well, so, you know, obviously, Mike's right. We had a big debate about expansion Medicaid. And those expanded are paid 90-10 versus 50-50. But understand that the cost of Medicaid in the state budget is going to continue to skyrocket because of age. I mean, people are simply living longer. So the amount of money that we put towards that line item in the budget, whether we expand it or not, is absolutely positively going to grow. This session, what am I going to do? Not as much as I tried to do last session, because I have now the distinction of being one of, I think, 10 members of the General Assembly who had a bill vetoed by a governor of his same party. Because for the Virginia Chamber of Commerce, I carried a consortium benefit plan trying to set up a larger umbrella, and then your companies could do individual. It's a group plan, so it doesn't take place in the marketplace. I'll spare you the pain associated with this conversation, but let's just say after further review by the replay official, I didn't score, despite having gotten it through both chambers. So I'm not going to go through that again. But George Barker, who carried a very similar thing, I see some realtors on this call. You know, realtors are hardworking, generally well-paid folks, and a lot of them cannot afford healthcare because they're beyond they're in the new donut hole, if you will. They're beyond the ability to get, and yet the marketplace costs so much money. So George is going to come back again with his bill that had the same distinction as mine. So we're going to continue to work on those things. If not mine this year, you're going to see it again from me in the future. One thing I want to point out that's really not a topic here is I do a lot of child welfare work. Child welfare psychiatric services have been paid by Child Services Act money, which is some sufficient from the state level. That, due to a recent change that I'm still trying to understand the mechanics of, will go to Medicaid. So that will go to a 50-50 match for localities and end up costing our localities more money. As I certainly won't bore you with all the family first work that's going on from the federal level to the state, getting some of our residential treatment facilities qualified is going to be difficult in the short term, which will put more burden on the localities as well. That's just dealing with children. And so I'm sorry to bother you with that. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is the more I dig into these things, the more difficult and complex it is to understand. And so as a citizen legislature, although this past year didn't feel like we were part-time, you know, it's hard to understand all the complexities of what we're talking about. But we do understand that though we have fewer uninsured people in Virginia, we still got a lot of work to do to get affordable health plans to hardworking Virginians.
Senator Norman, it looks like you want to say something.
Well, I just was going to add to it, and Monty really hit on it. One, it is an incredibly, I don't work in healthcare a lot. First of all, let me use that disclaimer. The complexity of it is mind-boggling. Secondly, the proportionality of the increase in Virginia's budget as it relates to healthcare in a variety of sectors is, the proportionality of it is extraordinary. Yep. And it is the fastest growing area of our budget, dollar-wise and a proportionality on it. And it's going to take, if we're going to do something on a state level, it is going to take some legislators with some very creative and innovative ideas. And Monty knows that I am supportive of the approach that he and George took. It did surprise me a little bit that a doctor who happens to be governor would veto that, because we are not going to be able to rely upon conventional approaches on increasing the amount of dollars going into healthcare. And it's going to take some innovative statewide approaches for us to address it. But it is, the dollars are going to continue to be disproportionately going in healthcare related services.
Anybody else before we move on to closing statements?
Yeah, just very briefly, I am by no means a subject matter expert on this, but we did set up the Virginia's Health Benefit Exchange. And I know that, the stated goal of that was trying to reduce the number of, Virginians who lack health insurance. Obviously, again, 2020 kind of threw a lot of that for a loop. The numbers, I think, were, kind of at an all-time low. Our uninsured numbers are at an all-time low. I would expect that those would tick up again. But, we're kind of at the outset of that. So I think it's a little too soon to see whether or not we see benefits from that or not. But again, that's kind of floating out there as well.
Thank you very much, Delegate Batten. So on to moving final statements. Before we close out, I'd like to ask each of you to make a final statement. It's not lost on us that everything we talked about today costs money, and the issues are very complex, as you ably explained. So, and as Delegate Batten said, a dollar spends only one way, right? So can you reflect upon that, or anything else you'd like the local business community to know in general about going into the general session that hasn't come up today already? So if it's okay with you, I'll start with you, Delegate Batten.
Sure. I think that, we're pretty comprehensive in what we covered today as best we could be. Going to the session, if you look at the list of bills that has been filed, it is, as of now, relatively small. I think a lot of us are kind of waiting to see who carries what. So maybe we don't have to carry something and we can reduce our own legislative burden, if you will. I would just ask, frankly, that everyone who's on this call, if you're here, I'm assuming that you're engaged in the legislative process and you're interested, and maybe you have a very specific issue that is a priority to you. To please, make us aware of it. This year is going to be very challenging, very different than anything we've had before. If you're a part of any realtors, anything like that, the typical, realtor day where everyone comes up and, shares with us their perspective in Richmond, we're not having that. And so I just ask that folks be, mindful and actively reaching out to us as legislators and sharing, concerns and thoughts on bills. What my office is doing is I have a district office here. It will be open full-time, staffed, of course, every day of the General Assembly session. I'll be kind of in and out. I'll be in Richmond some, I'll be in my office some, and I'll probably be working at home some, just like the rest of us. But that would be my only comment there as far as legislative priorities. The only other thing I'd like to add is I know it's been a really difficult year for Virginians. I know that I'm sure Monty and Mike and Tommy have experienced this as well, but we've done more constituent service this year than I can even really wrap my head around. Hundreds of people reaching out for assistance with unemployment, DMV problems, you name it. So for every person who's on this call, you probably know someone who's experienced some frustration. Either they were trying to get help from the government, or the government, like the DMV, was making life challenging for them if they needed to replace a license and just couldn't get in. So again, a word of encouragement, please don't hesitate to contact us if you or anyone you know, family member, employee, colleague, is having an issue with a state agency. That's really what we're here for. And it's a lot of what we're doing right now relative to years past. So again, I want to thank everyone for their time this morning. Again, thank you, Kira. Thank you, Angie, for coordinating, facilitating this. And hopefully we'll all be in touch during the upcoming months.
Thank you, Delegate Batten. We appreciate it. Senator Norment, would you like to offer a closing remark, please?
Thank you very much. Once again, I'd like to thank everybody for investing an hour or so of their time this morning and listening to the legislators babble about subjects they don't know anything about, but hope to know something. A couple of points. As I look at those on the screen, I want to thank Sherry Green for her leadership with the chamber, and I've had the opportunity to meet with her on a couple of issues, and I just wanted to thank her for reaching out. Also, I see a friend of mine who could not get into VMI and had to go to the Citadel instead, and that's my good friend Bob Hirschberger. And one of the things Bob has always reminded me of is be pragmatic and commonsensical, and I try to be that. And while I'm weak on the legislative end, I'm pretty strong when it comes to common sense implications on the legislative process. I think one of the things we've got to be very conscious of is the atmospheric conditions that exist within the legislature. And I am hopeful that we will not spend a disproportionate amount of time and focus on social and justice reform to the exclusion of other very pressing topics. That's not to say that we don't need to continue to do things, but we just cannot let it captivate the entire atmospheric conditions of the General Assembly. Secondly, from a commonsensical standpoint, this year is going to be an election year for 100 members of the House of Delegates, and the statewide races. Elections have consequences. We're going to see legislation that's going to be introduced and advocated by some who are seeking election or re-election that is designed to be brochure material. But that's expected during any election cycle, but the elections are going to have an impact on some of the legislation that's considered. It may have an impact on some of the legislation that is ultimately passed. A very significant concern that I have, and Amanda just touched on it, and that is the accessibility of the government relations community, and more importantly, of our citizens. With the House meeting remotely, with the General Assembly sequestered in the Science Museum, it's very, very challenging for our government relations community and our citizens to gain access to us. I think that's going to be something of an impediment during this session, no matter how hard the legislators reach out. But if the citizens and the government relations community are at the mercy of a cell phone, they're at the mercy of a text, they're at the mercy of an email, it's going to make it very challenging, even for those one-on-one contacts, not to even mention the group interaction, which is so important. One of the things that I have asked and have accomplished with the Senate Republican Caucus, as we have 2 minutes from the Science Museum, have leased a conference facility that's got the capacity of safe distancing of about 250 people. We are not going to do that. We're putting 18 tables in there with a couple of chairs at each table. There will be a provision for citizens and members of the government relations community to sign up to meet with their legislators and aides, trying to enhance the access. Not perfect, but at least an incremental step. The last thing I'd say is I really want to thank the other 3 members of the delegation for us to continue to work collaboratively. I think we do a pretty damn good job of communicating with one another and being mutually supportive on issues that are important to the historic triangle.
Thank you, Senator Norman. Senator Mason, do you have any final remarks?
Yeah, this is, we've talked through the challenges. There are a lot of ideas out there right now in an election year, as Tommy made mention, that are going to get a hearing that are that a lot of people believe in. A lot of people say we need to figure out how to get there. But just in the past 2 weeks, I probably have had 5+ conversations about monumental issues that people said, it was supposed to be studied by this group all year, but because of COVID, they didn't get together. Yet there's going to be a bill. One of them of interest to the business community is a privacy bill. I, as of last week, had not seen it. And we are maybe embarking on becoming the second state to set up some sort of privacy standard in the country. So you most certainly would want to look at that as a business community and weigh in. But just because major monumental policies are maybe not going to be able to get done in a very short, almost virtual session of the General Assembly doesn't mean we don't care. Doesn't mean we're not interested in them. Doesn't mean, but Tommy mentioned when you're talking about the vast structure that is our healthcare and HHR in Virginia, we have to figure out how to pay for it. All right. So that is always something important to keep in mind. The biggest message I have is be careful. April and May of this year, we were freaked out by this pandemic and this virus. What we're seeing right now is 3 times as bad. And yet, for some reason, we continue to do things that aren't safe and are putting people's lives at risk. Right now, we have to do a hell of a lot better job rolling out this vaccine. We need to be all hands on deck getting that done over the next few weeks. But as that is taking shape, please don't lose our patience. Please don't lose the focus that we need to continue to do the important things to come out of the other side of this. You know, I don't know how many of you on this call know somebody that died, but we just lost a member of the Republican caucus and probably my closest friend in the body. So
Sure, let me add something on that. Monty's right. He was the closest to Senator Ben Chase of any of the other 39 of us. As we've been on, I just got an email to reinforce what Monty just said. The positivity rate yesterday in Virginia, based on the tests that were administered yesterday, is exceeded 20%. 20% positivity rate on it. Not quite the highest we've had. About a week ago, a little over a week ago, we had 21%, but it is spiking, and we have not even gotten to the 14-day window from the frivolities that took place on New Year's Eve. So it is a very, very serious issue.
Thank you, Senator Norman. Thank you, Senator Mason. We appreciate your final.
thanks for doing this. I've been thumbing through the screen so I could just see everybody. I look forward to seeing you personally.
Delegate Mullen, your last up.
Well, first I want to thank you, Kira, and I want to thank Angie and everyone who've been able to put this together. It's been a pleasure over the course of the last 4 or 5 years to be able to spend the week before session with y'all. I wish it was face-to-face. I just miss seeing people in person. I would echo everything that Tommy, Monty, and Amanda have said. I have a secondary role in the House in trying to keep everybody in line. Probably herding cats is probably the best term, at least on my side of the aisle. And one of the things I've been trying to tell everybody is this is going to be a short session. Let's tamper down expectations a little bit. Don't put in your giant bill. Don't put in your world-changing budget amendment. Let's just try and get through the pandemic as best we can without deciding that we are going to rework the entirety of the economy, the entirety of the business community, the entirety of the manufacturing community. Let's just sort of lower expectations a little bit. I've been trying to tell that to everybody, and part of it is that on the House side, we only get 7 bills. I have a couple of members of my caucus who would prefer 40 to 50. I can think of one senator who averages about 67, 68 a year, and I know for a fact he is frothing at the mouth for just another 5 or 6. So we're not going to have the sheer volume of bills coming through. I share everyone's concerns about the increase in the pandemic. And I can tell you this, that everything that we've seen from the Virginia Department of Health has been wear a mask, socially distance, wash your hands. You can still have a business operating, but do those 3 things. And if you do those 3 things, we can remain open and we can do business and we can have people back at Busch Gardens, but we need to be consistent about those 3 things. And so I hope that we will see an increase in those as we go into this session starting up on the 13th. So Sorry, I'm getting a little long-winded. That's what us trial lawyers tend to do. And I appreciate y'all, and it's an honor and privilege to be here.
Thank you. So anyway, that wraps up our programming. I want to thank all of you for your participation and your attendance. Thank you, Angie, for your sponsorship and your participation in the Legislative Affairs Committee. And Terry, thank you to you and your staff for all the work that you did to put this event together. And I'd like to also thank the Legislative Affairs Committee as a whole, whose leadership and guidance has been phenomenal throughout the last year. Please stay in touch with this talented and dedicated group. We are lucky to have such a high quality General Assembly delegation. Really, we are lucky. This is an amazing group. But as they have all cautioned, please be patient and safe throughout this General Assembly. Changes probably are not going to be seismic this year. So, and again, if you had questions that I did not get to, we will be in touch with you after this event. Please give us about a week to do that. And finally, I just want to say thank you for listening, and please take care of yourselves. And if you're able, take care of someone else too. So with that, we will sign off.